A cold-hearted millionaire lived in his imposing mansion. One day he noticed a beautiful young woman walking the streets. She was the daughter of the gardener who worked at his estate. The millionaire then decides to marry her by force and out of convenience. Before hearing this twist, remember to subscribe to the channel. The sun had barely risen when Richard Thompson was already up, impeccably dressed in his custom-made Italian suit. His cold eyes scanned the spacious room, decorated with expensive furniture and valuable artwork, yet devoid of any human warmth. It was the perfect reflection of his own existence. At 35, Richard was the heir to the Thompson Empire, a conglomerate of businesses spanning various sectors of the American economy. Since taking control of operations 5 years ago, profits had doubled. His name was synonymous with success in business circles, but few knew the man behind the mask of coldness and efficiency. He descended the marble staircase of the mansion, his footsteps echoing through the empty space. The staff, already accustomed to his routine, discreetly stayed out of sight. Richard liked it that way. Unnecessary interactions were, in his opinion, a waste of time. In the dining room, he found his father, Anthony Thompson, having breakfast while reading the newspaper. The family patriarch glanced up briefly, his gaze as cold as his son's. "Good morning, Richard," said Anthony, his voice devoid of any affection. "I hope you're prepared for the meeting with the investors today." Richard nodded, pouring himself a cup of black coffee. "As always, father. The numbers speak for themselves. There's no reason for concern." Anthony folded the newspaper, staring at his son intently. "Numbers are important, Richard, but they're not everything. The investors are concerned about your personal situation." Richard raised an eyebrow, his expression impassive. "My personal situation? Your lack of a wife, of a family," Anthony explained, his voice tinged with frustration. "They want stability, Richard. A single man at your age doesn't convey the image of reliability we need." The young businessman felt a pang of irritation but didn't let it show. Emotions were a weakness he couldn't afford to display. "My marital status is irrelevant to business, father. My competence—" "Don't be naive," Anthony interrupted, slamming his hand on the table. "Image is everything in this world. A married man with a family conveys stability, commitment. That's what we need now, especially with the expansion we're planning." Richard remained silent, his mind already weighing the pros and cons of the situation. His father, despite his old-fashioned methods, was rarely wrong when it came to business. If a marriage was necessary to ensure the success of the expansion, then it would be treated like any other business transaction. "What do you suggest?" he finally asked, his voice neutral. Anthony smiled, a cold smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I've already thought of that. The Almeida daughter would be a suitable choice. A traditional family, good reputation." "No," Richard cut in, surprising even himself with the vehemence of his refusal. The idea of marrying someone from his social circle, someone who would perfectly understand the nature of the arrangement, bothered him in a way he couldn't explain. "If I'm going to do this, it will be on my terms." Anthony furrowed his brow but nodded slowly. "Very well, but be quick, Richard. Time is against us." With that, the patriarch stood up and left, leaving Richard alone with his thoughts. The young businessman finished his coffee mechanically, his mind already mapping out plans and strategies. As he drove his luxury car through the streets of New York toward the office, Richard allowed himself a moment of reflection. Marriage. The idea had never crossed his mind before, not as a real possibility. Since his mother's death when he was just 12, Richard had learned to suppress his emotions, to protect himself from the kind of pain that loss could bring. His father, devastated by the loss of his wife, had become even colder and more distant. Richard's upbringing had turned into rigorous training for business. There was no room for sentimentality or weakness. Love, Anthony had taught, was a dangerous distraction in the world of business. And Richard had learned that lesson well. Over the years, he had focused exclusively on his career, avoiding long-term relationships. The few women who had passed through his life were like him, cold, calculating, interested only in the advantages they could gain from associating with the Thompson name. Now, at 35, the idea of marriage caught him off guard. But Richard was not a man to be shaken for long. If a marriage was necessary for business, then it would be treated as such, a transaction, a contract with clear and defined terms. Arriving at the imposing headquarters of Thompson Enterprises, Richard parked his car and walked briskly to the elevator. Employees greeted him respectfully, but no one dared to start a conversation. The aura of power and coldness he exuded kept everyone at a safe distance. In his office on the top floor with a panoramic view of the city, Richard sat in his leather chair and turned on his computer. He had an hour before the meeting with investors, enough time to review the numbers one last time and think about his new task. His fingers drummed on the desk as his mind worked. An arranged marriage wasn't uncommon in his social circle, but the idea of marrying someone from his own class didn't sit well with him. It would be too complicated, full of power games and conflicting interests. No, what he needed was someone simple, someone who didn't understand the nuances of the business world, someone who could be easily controlled and kept on the sidelines of his real life. Someone who would accept a temporary arrangement without asking too many questions. His eyes turned to the window, observing the well-maintained gardens surrounding the building. And then, as if fate had orchestrated that moment, he saw her. A young woman, probably no more than 25, was walking among the flowers. Her simple floral dress contrasted with the corporate setting around her. She carried a basket of freshly cut flowers, and her face radiated a bright smile as she chatted animatedly with an older man whom Richard recognized as the head gardener. Something about that scene caught Richard's attention. The simplicity, the unpretentious joy of the young woman was something so far removed from his world that it seemed almost unreal. And it was then that the idea began to form in his mind. A simple girl, the daughter of an employee, someone who would be dazzled by the opportunity of a life of luxury, even if temporary, someone who wouldn't ask difficult questions and would accept the terms he imposed. Richard picked up the phone and dialed the Human Resources Department. "I need information on the head gardener," he ordered, "and his daughter, if he has one." While waiting for the information, Richard turned his attention to the window. The young woman was still there, her smile lighting up the garden in a way he couldn't fully understand. For a brief moment, he felt something strange in his chest, a sensation he couldn't quite name. He shook his head, dismissing the unwelcome thought. This was business, nothing more. A contract, a transaction, and he always fulfilled his contracts to the letter. The phone rang, delivering the information he had requested. Richard listened carefully, a cold smile forming on his lips. Perfect. The girl was exactly what he needed. He stood up, adjusting his impeccable suit. He had a meeting with investors to lead and, afterward, a very peculiar business proposal to make. As he walked to the meeting room, Richard Thompson had no idea that this decision, made as coldly as so many others in his life, was about to shake the foundations of his carefully constructed world. Fate, at times, has a peculiar sense of humor, and the man who believed he had everything under control was about to discover that the heart has reasons that reason itself cannot comprehend. The afternoon sun bathed the gardens of Thompson Enterprises in a golden light, making the flowers shine like living jewels. For Caroline Smith, 24 years old, there was no more beautiful place in the world. The daughter of the head gardener, Anthony Smith, she had grown up among the roses and jasmine, learning to love every plant, every leaf, as if they were extensions of her own family. "Look at this orchid, Dad," exclaimed Caroline, kneeling beside a delicate purple flower. "It finally bloomed. I knew with a little more care it would make it." Anthony smiled, his face weathered by time and outdoor work lighting up with his daughter's enthusiasm. "You have a gift, my flower. These plants respond to your touch as if they understood your language." Caroline laughed, a crystalline sound that seemed to blend harmoniously with the buzzing of bees and the singing of birds. "Oh, come on, Dad. It's just a little patience and a lot of love. Plants are like people, you know? Sometimes they just need a little attention to bloom." As they worked side by side, Caroline couldn't help but notice the weariness in her father's eyes. At 60, Anthony was still a strong man, but the years of hard work were beginning to take their toll. His back pain was more frequent, and the cough that plagued him on cold mornings worried her more and more. "Dad," she began hesitantly. Don't you think it's time to consider retiring? I know you love this job, but... Anthony shook his head, gently interrupting her. Don't worry about me, Carol. This garden is my life. And besides, he added with a sad smile, you know we can't afford retirement right now, not with the debts we still have to pay. Caroline felt a tightening in her heart. The debts. Always the debts. The result of years of medical treatments for her mother, who had passed away 5 years ago after a prolonged illness. Even with Anthony's salary and what Caroline earned from tutoring biology, they could barely keep up with the bills. I could get another job, Caroline suggested, not for the first time. Something full-time with my biology degree, I'm sure I could. Not a chance, Anthony was firm. You already work too much with the tutoring, and I know how much you love coming here to help me. I won't let you sacrifice your dreams for my sake. Carolina wanted to argue, to say that taking care of him was her dream, that she didn't mind working more, doing whatever it took to ensure he had a peaceful old age. But she knew her father well. His stubbornness was as strong as his love for plants. They returned to work in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Caroline loved these moments in the garden. Here, far from the frantic world outside, she felt at peace. The plants didn't judge, didn't demand. They just grew at their own pace, responding to the care and love they received. As she pruned some rose bushes, Caroline let her mind wander. She remembered her mother, so kind and loving, always with a smile on her face, even on the hardest days of her illness. It was her who taught Caroline to see beauty in all things, to find joy in the small moments. Life is like a garden, my love, her mother used to say. Sometimes you find thorns, but if you have patience and care, there will always be flowers to pick. Caroline lived by those words. Even with all the difficulties, she strived to stay optimistic, to see the good side in every situation. It was this attitude that made her beloved by everyone who knew her, from the other employees at the company to the students she tutored. Suddenly, a movement in the window on the top floor of the building caught her attention. For a brief moment, Caroline thought she saw someone watching her, but when she looked again, the window was empty. It must be Mr. Thompson, Anthony commented, noticing his daughter's gaze. He often stays late at the office. Caroline nodded, a pang of curiosity hitting her. Richard Thompson, the young and powerful CEO of Thompson Enterprises, was almost a mythical figure to the employees. Few saw him in person, and the stories about his coldness and efficiency were legendary. He seems so lonely, Caroline murmured, more to herself than to her father. Anthony shrugged. The rich have their own problems, daughter. It's not for us to judge. Caroline agreed, but she couldn't help feeling a pang of compassion. She imagined what it would be like to live in that world of business, always under pressure, with no time to appreciate the simple things in life. The rest of the afternoon passed quickly, with father and daughter working in harmony, preparing the garden for the next day. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Caroline said goodbye to her father with a loving kiss. Don't overwork yourself, Dad, promise? Anthony smiled, tenderly stroking his daughter's face. I promise, my flower. Now go. I don't want you to miss the bus. Caroline nodded, grabbing her bag and casting one last look at the garden. That's when she noticed a man in a suit walking toward her. Her heart skipped a beat when she recognized Richard Thompson. The businessman approached with firm steps, his face a mask of impassivity. Miss Smith? His voice was deep and controlled. Yes? Caroline stammered, surprised that he knew her name. I would like to speak with you for a moment. It's about a matter of utmost importance. Caroline shot a confused glance at her father, who seemed just as surprised as she was. Anthony made a move to approach, but Richard raised his hand in a gesture to stop him. Alone, if possible, he added, his tone leaving no room for argument. With her heart racing and 1,000 questions swirling in her mind, Caroline nodded hesitantly. Of course, Mr. Thompson. As she followed the imposing businessman to a more secluded corner of the garden, Caroline couldn't imagine what he could possibly want with her. Little did she know, she was about to receive a proposal that would completely change the course of her life. Caroline's heart pounded as she followed Richard Thompson to a more isolated part of the garden. The scent of the roses she loved So much now felt almost suffocating, mingling with the expensive fragrance of the businessman's cologne. They stopped near a stone bench, surrounded by neatly trimmed bushes that offered a certain degree of privacy. Richard turned to face her, his cold eyes studying every detail of the young woman's face. Caroline felt exposed, as if she were being appraised. Instinctively, she smoothed her simple dress, suddenly aware of the dirt stains on her hands. "Miss Smith," Richard began, his voice controlled and professional, "I have a proposal for you. A proposal that could significantly change your life and that of your father." Caroline blinked, confused. "A proposal, Mr. Thompson? I don't understand. If it's about the garden, my father—" "This is not about the garden," Richard interrupted, a slight edge of impatience in his voice. "It's about an agreement, a contract, if you will, of a personal nature." Caroline's brow furrowed. "Personal? But we barely know each other, Mr. Thompson. I'm just the gardener's daughter." A cold smile curved Richard's lips. "Exactly why I'm making this proposal to you, Miss Smith. Your simplicity is precisely what I'm looking for." Caroline felt a pang of indignation at the word simplicity, but curiosity got the better of her. "And what would this proposal be, Mr. Thompson?" Richard took a deep breath as if preparing to close a major deal. "Marriage, Miss Smith. I'm proposing that you marry me." The world seemed to spin around Caroline. She leaned against the stone bench, feeling her legs weaken. Marriage," she stammered, certain she had misunderstood. "You must be joking." "I never joke about business, Miss Smith," Richard replied, his voice as cold as ice. "And that's exactly what this is. A business. A mutually beneficial arrangement." Caroline shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts. "But why? You're rich, powerful. You could marry anyone. Why me?" Richard took a few steps through the garden, his hands in the pockets of his expensive suit. "My reasons are my own, Miss Smith. What you need to know is that this marriage would be temporary. A year at most. During that time, you would live in the Thompson mansion, accompany me to social events, and play the role of a devoted wife to the outside world." Caroline stared at him, wide-eyed. "And what would I get out of it?" A calculating gleam appeared in Richard's eyes. "Money, Miss Smith. Enough to pay off all your father's debts, ensure his comfortable retirement, and still leave you with enough to pursue your dreams. Study, travel, whatever you want." Caroline's heart raced. The thought of freeing her father from debt, of seeing him finally rest without worries. It was tempting more than she cared to admit. "And after the year?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "We'll divorce discreetly. You'll keep the money, of course, and you can go on with your life as you see fit. All I ask for is absolute discretion about the nature of our arrangement." Caroline closed her eyes, feeling dizzy. It was madness, of course it was. Marrying a stranger, pretending a love that didn't exist. It went against everything she believed in. But then she thought of her father, of the nights she heard him coughing, of the worry lines deepening on his face with every bill that arrived. "Why should I believe you'll hold up your end?" she asked, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. Richard raised an eyebrow, looking almost impressed. "I'm a businessman, Miss Smith. My word is my most valuable asset. I'll draft a contract if you prefer, specifying all the terms." Caroline took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision on her shoulders. I need to think. I need to talk to my father." "Understandable," Richard nodded, "but I need an answer by tomorrow. Time is essential in this business." He took a card from his pocket and handed it to Caroline. "My personal number. Call me as soon as you have a decision." With that, he turned and walked back to the building, leaving Caroline alone in the garden, the card weighing heavily in her hand as if it were made of lead. For long minutes, Caroline remained motionless, trying to process what had just happened. The sun had completely set, and the first stars began to dot the darkened sky. The garden, her refuge, now felt strange and alien. With trembling steps, she walked back to where her father was waiting, his face a mask of concern. "Carol, what happened? What did Mr. Thompson want?" Caroline opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. How could she explain? something she barely understood herself. How could she tell her father that she had the chance to solve all their problems, but at the cost of her own freedom? "Dad," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I think we need to talk. It's something important." The way home had never felt so long. On the crowded bus, Caroline clung to her bag as if it were a lifeline, Richard's card burning in her pocket. Her mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts and emotions. Arriving at the small apartment they shared, Caroline and Anthony sat down at the kitchen table. The cramped room, with its worn furniture and peeling walls, had never felt so comforting, and yet so suffocating to Caroline. With her heart in her throat, she began to tell her father about Richard's proposal. She saw Anthony's eyes widen in shock, then narrow in suspicion, and finally fill with a mix of fear and hope. "No, Carol," Anthony said firmly when she finished. "It's madness. I can't let you sacrifice your life like this for my sake." Caroline took her father's calloused hands in hers. "But Dad, think about it. All our debts paid. You could retire. Take care of your health, and it's only for a year." Anthony shook his head, tears glistening in his eyes. "A year is too long to live a lie, my flower. And that man, he's cold calculating. How can I trust that he won't hurt you?" Caroline swallowed hard, her own doubts echoing in her father's words. But then her eyes fell on the stack of bills on the table, on the medicine bottles that Anthony sometimes skipped to save money. "Dad," she said softly, "my whole life you've taken care of me, protected me, gave me everything you could. Now it's my turn to take care of you." Anthony opened his mouth to protest, but Caroline continued, "I won't make any decision without thinking it through. I promise, but I think we should at least consider it." Silence fell over the small kitchen, heavy and oppressive. Father and daughter stood there, hands intertwined, each lost in their own thoughts and fears. Hours later, lying in her narrow bed, Caroline stared at the ceiling, sleep completely eluding her. Richard's card was on the nightstand, the numbers printed on it seeming to glow in the dark. Marrying a stranger, living a lie, entering a world of luxury and power she could barely imagine. It was terrifying, it was madness. But then she thought of her father, of how he deserved rest and comfort after a lifetime of hard work. She thought of the opportunities that money could bring, not just for her, but to help others. With a trembling sigh, Caroline reached out and picked up her phone. Her hands shook as she typed the message. "Mr. Thompson, this is Caroline Smith. I would like to discuss your proposal further. Can we meet tomorrow?" She sent it before she could change her mind and let the phone drop onto the bed. Her heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might leap out of her chest. Outside, the moon shone over the sky of New York, indifferent, dead of the human dramas unfolding under its silver light. And Caroline, the simple gardener's daughter, was about to take the first step on a journey that would change her life forever. The morning came too quickly for Caroline. She had barely closed her eyes when the alarm rang, announcing the start of a day that promised to change her life forever. With mechanical movements, she got up and got ready, choosing a simple yet elegant dress, the best she had in her modest wardrobe. As she entered the kitchen, she found her father already awake, the dark circles under his eyes betraying a night as sleepless as hers. Anthony looked at her with a mix of concern and resignation. "Are you sure about this, my flower?" he asked, his voice hoarse with fatigue. Caroline forced a smile, trying to appear more confident than she felt. "I have to at least hear what he has to say, Dad. It doesn't mean I'll accept." Anthony nodded slowly, taking his daughter's hands in his. "I just want you to know that, no matter what you decide, I support you. Your happiness is the most important thing to me." Her father's words almost made Caroline give up right then and there. But she remembered the bills, the debts, the cough she heard at night. With a loving kiss on her father's cheek, she left, her heart heavy but determined. The journey to Thompson Enterprises seemed shorter than ever. Before she knew it, Caroline was standing in front of the imposing building, her reflection distorted in the mirrored windows. She took a deep breath, adjusted her dress one last time, and walked in. At the reception, an elegant woman was waiting for her. "Miss Smith? Mr. Thompson is expecting you in his office. Please follow me." The elevator rose smoothly to the top floor, each passing floor increasing Caroline's anxiety. When the doors opened, she was led down a silent hallway to a large carved wooden door. "You may go in," the receptionist said, with a professional smile before retreating. With her heart racing, Caroline knocked lightly on the door and entered. Richard Thompson's office was exactly as she had imagined, spacious, elegant, and cold. Large windows offered a panoramic view of the city, reminding everyone who was on top. Richard stood by the window, his hands in the pockets of his impeccable suit. "Miss Smith," he turned, his face a mask of neutrality. "Thank you for coming. Please have a seat." Caroline settled into one of the chairs in front of the imposing mahogany desk, feeling small and out of place in that environment. Richard sat down across from her, his eyes studying Caroline with an intensity that made her squirm uncomfortably. "So," he began, "I assume you're considering my proposal?" Caroline nodded slowly. "Yes, but I have many doubts, Mr. Thompson, many concerns." A faint smile curved Richard's lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Understandable. How about we start with the terms of the agreement?" He opened a drawer and pulled out a document, placing it on the table between them. "This is the contract I mentioned. It outlines all the terms of our arrangement." Caroline picked up the document with trembling hands, her eyes scanning the pages. Legal terms and complex clauses danced before her eyes, but a few phrases stood out. Duration of 1 year, public appearances, financial compensation. "As you can see," Richard continued, his voice cold and professional, "the contract stipulates that our marriage will last exactly 1 year. During that time, you will live in the Thompson mansion and accompany me to social and corporate events, as needed. In return, all of your father's debts will be settled immediately, and you will receive a generous financial compensation at the end of the contract." Caroline swallowed hard, the reality of the situation finally hitting her with full force. "And what about intimacy?" she asked, feeling her face burn with shame. Richard raised an eyebrow. "There will be none, Miss Smith. This is a purely business arrangement. We will have separate rooms and our personal lives will remain just that, personal." A mix of relief and, surprisingly, a twinge of disappointment passed through Caroline's chest. She shook her head, pushing away those confusing thoughts. "And after the year, what happens?" "We will divorce discreetly," Richard replied without hesitation. "You will be free to live your life as you see fit, with enough financial resources to pursue your dreams. All I ask for is absolute discretion regarding the nature of our arrangement." Caroline was silent for a long moment, her eyes returning to the contract in her hands. It was surreal. Her entire life reduced to a legal document, a year of her existence turned into a business transaction. "Why me?" she finally asked, looking up to meet Richard's gaze. "Of all people, why choose the gardener's daughter?" For the first time, Richard seemed to hesitate. Something flickered in his eyes so quickly that Caroline almost missed it. A shadow of what? Vulnerability. But soon the mask of indifference was back. "Simplicity, Miss Smith. You have no connections in the corporate world. You don't understand the power games that permeate my social circle. That makes you convenient." The words were cold, almost cruel, but Caroline sensed something more behind them. A loneliness, perhaps. A deep distrust of the world around him. She took a deep breath, trying to organize her thoughts. What if I fall in love with someone else during this year?" Richard shrugged, a deliberately casual gesture. "The contract doesn't forbid discreet relationships, as long as they don't interfere with our public appearances or cause scandals." Caroline nodded slowly, a knot forming in her throat. Everything was so cold, so calculated. Was this how rich people lived, turning even love into a business equation? I need some time to think," she finally said. "To talk to my father, to—" "I understand," Richard interrupted, his voice soft but firm. "But time is of the essence, Miss Smith. I need an answer by the end of the day." Caroline stood up, feeling dizzy. The world seemed to spin around her, the implications of her decision weighing on her shoulders like a ton of bricks. When she reached the door, Richard's voice stopped her. "Miss Smith." She turned, meeting those cold eyes once more. "I know it seems frightening," he said, and for a moment, Caroline thought she saw a flicker of understanding, empathy. "But think of the benefits, the security it will bring for your father, the opportunities that will open up for you." Caroline nodded mechanically and left, her legs trembling as she walked down the hallway. In the elevator alone, she finally let the tears fall. Tears of fear, of doubt, of a strange mix of hope and despair. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Caroline wandered through the company gardens, her refuge, trying to find clarity among the flowers she loved so much. She called her father, explaining the terms of the contract, listening to his voice choked with worry and love. As the sun began to set, painting the New York sky with shades of orange and pink, Caroline found herself once again in front of the Thompson Enterprises building. Her heart raced, her hands sweated. With hesitant steps, she entered the lobby and approached the receptionist. "Please," her voice came out shaky, "could you inform Mr. Thompson that Caroline Smith is here? I have an answer for him." As she waited, Caroline closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. "Life is like a garden, my love. Sometimes you find thorns, but if you have patience and care, there will always be flowers to pick." She just hoped that in the strange and unfamiliar garden she was about to enter, she could find some flowers among the thorns that surely awaited her. The elevator doors opened, and Richard Thompson stepped out, his face a mask of controlled anticipation. "Miss Smith," he said, his voice low. "Your decision?" Caroline took one last deep breath, feeling the weight of the world on her shoulders. With a voice that didn't seem like her own, she replied, "I accept, Mr. Thompson. I will marry you." The days following Caroline's decision passed in a whirlwind of activity and conflicting emotions. As soon as she said yes to Richard, the gears of the Thompson empire began to turn with frightening efficiency. The next morning, Caroline was surprised by the arrival of a team of lawyers and advisors at her modest home. They brought a stack of documents to be signed, each page further sealing the agreement that would change her life. "These are the papers for the settlement of your father's debts," explained a soft-spoken but sharp-eyed lawyer. "And this is the confidentiality agreement that both you and your father must sign." Caroline looked at Anthony, who was sitting beside her, his face a mix of worry and guilt. He squeezed his daughter's hand, a silent gesture of support and love. "It's okay, Dad," Caroline whispered, forcing a smile. "It's the best for both of us." With trembling hands, they signed document after document. Each signature seemed to seal Caroline's fate a little more, pulling her away from the simple life she knew and thrusting her into an unknown and intimidating world. In the days that followed, Caroline's life became a whirlwind of preparations. A team of stylists invaded her small room, bringing with them a profusion of clothes, shoes, and accessories that cost more than she had ever dreamed of owning. "The wardrobe of a Thompson must live up to the name," declared the head stylist, an elegant woman with a critical eye. "We'll have to redo your entire look, darling." Caroline found herself trying on designer dresses, vertiginous heels, and jewelry that sparkled with almost blinding brilliance. Each piece seemed to distance her a little more from who she was, transforming her into the image of what a Mrs. Thompson should be. Between clothing fittings and makeup sessions, Caroline tried to process how quickly her life was changing. In just 1 week, she would go from being a simple private tutor and gardener's daughter to the wife of one of the most powerful men in New York. The nights were the hardest. Lying in her single bed, which she would soon trade for a luxurious suite in the Thompson mansion, Caroline let the tears flow freely. Tears of fear for the unknown, of guilt for leaving her father, of a strange mix of excitement and dread for the future that awaited her. One afternoon, as she was organizing the few personal items she would take to her new life, Caroline was surprised by a soft knock on her bedroom door. It was Anthony, his eyes red and swollen, holding something in his calloused hands. "Carol, my flower," he began, his voice choked. I wanted to give you this." He handed her a small package, and Caroline opened it carefully. Inside, was a delicate silver necklace with a flower-shaped pendant. "It was your mother's," Anthony explained, tears now streaming down his wrinkled face. "She wanted you to wear it on your wedding day." Caroline felt her heart tighten. She hugged her father tightly, their tears mingling. "Oh, Dad," she sobbed. "I'm so sorry. I wish it were different, that—" Anthony gently pulled her away, holding his daughter's face in his hands. "No, my flower, don't apologize. You're doing this for us, I know. But promise me one thing." Caroline nodded, unable to speak. "Promise me you won't lose yourself in this new world, that you'll keep being my Carol, my little flower who always sees the best in people and situations." "I promise, Dad," Caroline whispered, clutching the necklace to her chest. "I promise." The following days passed in a blur of final preparations. The ceremony would be small and discreet, attended only by a few executives from Thompson Enterprises and, of course, Anthony. Richard had made it clear that he wanted to keep the event away from the press, at least for now. On the eve of the wedding, Caroline was in her room, looking out the window at the garden that had always been her refuge. The flowers she and her father had cultivated with so much love seemed to wave at her, as if saying goodbye. A soft sound pulled her from her thoughts. It was her phone, vibrating with a message. To her surprise, it was from Richard. "I hope you're ready for tomorrow. Remember, punctuality is essential. The car will pick you up at 9 a.m. sharp." Caroline reread the message several times. So cold, so impersonal. Was this what her life would be like from now on? Married to a man who saw her as nothing more than a business transaction? With a heavy sigh, she lay down, her mother's necklace firmly in her hand. Tomorrow she would become Caroline Thompson. The idea felt surreal, as if she were about to step into a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. As sleep finally enveloped her, Caroline couldn't imagine the challenges, surprises, and emotions that awaited her in her new life. The wedding would be just the beginning of a journey that would test her strength, her courage, and above all, her heart. The morning of the wedding arrived with a blinding brightness. Caroline woke up even before the alarm went off, her stomach a knot of nerves and anticipation. She got up slowly, as if each movement brought her closer to an inevitable fate. She looked at herself in the mirror, studying the face that would soon be known as Mrs. Thompson's. Her eyes, usually bright and full of life, seemed shadowed by apprehension, but there was also a determination there, a strength she didn't know she possessed. "You can do this, Carol," she whispered to her reflection. "For you, for Dad, for a better future." At 8:45 a.m., dressed in an elegant but understated white dress, Caroline walked down the stairs of her house for the last time as a Smith. Anthony was waiting for her in the living room, wearing his best suit, his eyes shining, with a mix of pride and sadness. "My flower," he said, his voice choked. "You look beautiful." Caroline hugged him tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of earth and love that she would always associate with her father. "Thank you, Dad, for everything." The sound of a honk broke the moment. The car had arrived. It was time. With one last look at the house that had always been her home, Caroline stepped out, Anthony by her side. The driver, a middle-aged man with a neutral expression, opened the door of the luxurious car. As the vehicle moved away, taking her toward her new destiny, Caroline gazed out the window, watching her old life fade into the distance. The familiar streets of the neighborhood gave way to wider avenues and taller buildings. It was as if she were not just crossing the city, but stepping into an entirely new world. The car finally stopped in front of an imposing building in the heart of the city. It was there, in that upscale notary office, that her life would change forever. With her heart pounding, Caroline stepped out of the car, her father by her side. She took a deep breath, clutched her mother's necklace around her neck, and took the first step toward her future. Richard Thompson awaited her at the top of the staircase, his suit impeccable and his expression unreadable. For a moment, their eyes met, and Caroline felt a shiver run down her spine. What did fate have in store for her in this new life? The interior of the notary office was a study in understated opulence. Polished marble, fine wood, and gold accents created an atmosphere of restrained wealth, so different from the world Caroline was accustomed to. She felt the curious gazes of the few attendees, high-ranking executives from Thompson Enterprises and their companions, assessing her, judging her. Richard stood by her side, a towering yet distant presence. He didn't smile, but his eyes occasionally turned to Caroline, as if checking to see if she was still there, if she hadn't backed out at the last moment. The ceremony was brief and formal. The judge, a middle-aged man with a bored expression, recited the customary words without emotion. When the moment came to say "I do," Caroline felt her throat go dry. For a moment, everything seemed unreal, as if she were watching a movie of her own life. "I do," she finally said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I do," Richard replied, his tone firm and controlled. The rings were exchanged, simple white gold bands yet visibly expensive. Caroline noticed Richard's hand trembled slightly as he slid the ring onto her finger. A flicker of nervousness? Impossible, she thought. Richard Thompson didn't get nervous. With the signing of the papers, it was done. Caroline Smith was now officially Caroline Thompson. The reception that followed was as restrained as the ceremony. In a private room at a nearby luxury hotel, the guests gathered for an elegant luncheon. Caroline found herself surrounded by people whose names she could barely remember, all smiling, politely but with looks that ranged from curiosity to suspicion. "So, Mrs. Thompson," an elegant woman approached, her smile not reaching her eyes, "how does it feel to be the newest addition to the family?" Caroline swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her new last name. "It's an honor," she replied, trying to sound confident. "I look forward to getting to know everyone better." The woman laughed, an artificial sound. "Oh dear, I'm sure you do. It will be interesting to see how you adapt." Before Caroline could respond, she felt a hand on her back. It was Richard, his touch surprisingly gentle. "I see you've met my aunt, Mrs. Thompson," he said, his voice neutral. "I hope you're being well received." Richard's aunt smiled again, this time with a hint of challenge. "Of course, dear. We are all delighted with your choice." With a nod, she walked away, leaving Caroline with an uneasy feeling. Richard leaned in, whispering in her ear, "Don't worry about her. Or about any of them. Remember our agreement." Caroline nodded, grateful for his intervention, but at the same time aware of the coldness in his words. It was a reminder that no matter how much it seemed like a twisted fairy tale, this was a business arrangement. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of smiling faces and superficial conversations. Caroline struggled to maintain her composure, to smile and act as if she belonged in that world. But with each passing minute, she felt more and more like an imposter. Finally, as the sun began to set, Richard announced it was time to leave. Caroline said goodbye to her father with a tight hug, the tears she had held back all day finally threatening to fall. "Be strong, my flower," Anthony whispered. "Remember who you are." With one last glance back, Caroline followed Richard to the waiting limousine. As the car glided through the streets of New York, she watched the city change. The buildings becoming more spaced out, the streets more tree-lined. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the car stopped in front of an imposing gate. With a soft buzz, the gate opened, revealing a driveway lined with century-old trees. The Thompson mansion loomed before them, a majestic structure that seemed straight out of a movie. Caroline felt her breath catch. This would be her new home. Richard stepped out of the car first, extending his hand to help her. For a moment, their eyes met, and Caroline thought she saw something. Hesitation, concern in his gaze. But it passed so quickly that she thought she might have imagined it. "Welcome to your new home, Mrs. Thompson," Richard said, his voice neutral. Caroline took a step toward the mansion, feeling the weight of her new reality. The doors opened, revealing an interior as luxurious as the exterior promised. A line of staff awaited them, all impeccably dressed and with carefully neutral expressions. "This is Mrs. Elisa, the housekeeper," Richard introduced a middle-aged woman with a stern expression. "She will show you to your quarters and help you settle in." Caroline nodded, grateful to have someone to guide her in this new world. "And where will your quarters be?" she asked hesitantly. Richard seemed surprised by the question. On the other side of the mansion, of course. Remember, Mrs. Thompson, this is a convenience arrangement. There's no need to... Of course, Caroline interrupted, feeling her face burn with shame. I just wanted to know. An uncomfortable silence fell between them. Finally, Richard cleared his throat. Well, I have work to do. Feel free to explore the property. Dinner will be served at 8 p.m. if you'd like to join me. With that, he turned and disappeared down a hallway, leaving Caroline alone with Mrs. Elisa and her new life. As she followed the housekeeper through the ornate corridors of the mansion, Caroline felt as though she were walking in a dream, or perhaps an elaborate nightmare. Each room they passed was more impressive than the last, adorned with artwork. That likely cost more than she would earn in several lifetimes. Finally, they arrived at a pair of carved wooden doors. Mrs. Elisa opened them, revealing a suite larger than the entire apartment where Caroline had lived with her father. Your quarters, ma'am, the housekeeper announced, her voice professional and distant. Caroline stepped in hesitantly, her eyes scanning the luxurious room. The king-size bed with silk sheets, the walk-in closet the size of her old bedroom, the marble bathroom with a bathtub that looked more like a swimming pool. Your belongings have already been brought in and arranged, Mrs. Elisa continued. If you need anything, just call. The intercom is by the bed. Caroline nodded, feeling small and lost in the vast space. Thank you, Mrs. Elisa. The housekeeper, made to leave but paused at the door, turning back with a slightly softer expression. Ma'am, I know you must be feeling overwhelmed. If you need anything, I'm here for you. With a small smile of gratitude, Caroline watched the door close, leaving her alone in her new world. Finally alone, Caroline let the tears she had held back all day flow freely. She sat on the edge of the enormous bed, feeling more alone than ever. Her eyes fell on her simple suitcase, looking out of place amidst all the luxury. With trembling hands, she opened it, searching for something familiar, something that would remind her of who she was. At the bottom of the suitcase, she found a small pot with a budding orchid, the same one that had bloomed in the company garden days ago. Her father must have placed it there as a surprise. Caroline hugged the pot, her tears now ones of gratitude. It was a piece of her world, a reminder of who she was and where she came from. She placed the orchid on the nightstand, a touch of life and simplicity amidst the oppressive luxury. Looking at the delicate flower, Caroline made a silent promise to herself. No matter what happened, no matter how difficult this new world was, she would not lose her essence. Like the orchid, she would find a way to bloom even in the most unlikely environment. With a deep sigh, Caroline stood up. She had a dinner to prepare for and a new life to face. The future was uncertain, but she was determined to meet it head-on. Dinner at the Thompson mansion was a formal affair, even when only Richard and Caroline were present. The dining room, with its crystal chandelier and silver cutlery, seemed too large for just two people. Caroline entered hesitantly, wearing one of the new dresses that had been chosen for her, an elegant design in shades of blue that brought out her eyes. Richard was already seated at the head of the table, his eyes quickly scanning the financial newspaper in his hands. "Good evening," Caroline said softly, catching his attention. Richard looked up, and for a moment, Caroline thought she saw a flicker of something in his gaze, surprise, admiration. But soon his expression returned to its usual neutrality. "Good evening, Mrs. Thompson," he replied, folding the newspaper and setting it aside. "I hope you've settled in properly." Caroline nodded, sitting in the chair that a silent butler pulled out for her. "Yes, thank you. The suite is impressive." An uncomfortable silence fell over them as the first course was served, an asparagus soup that looked more like a work of art than food. Caroline tasted it hesitantly, surprised by the delicate flavor. "So," Richard began, his voice controlled, "I believe we should discuss some practical details of our arrangement." Caroline swallowed hard, nodding. "Of course. As you know, there will be social and corporate events you'll need to accompany me to," he continued, as if discussing a business strategy. "Mrs. Elisa will assist you with the necessary etiquette and protocol. It's crucial that you behave in a manner befitting a Mrs. Thompson. Caroline felt a pang of irritation at his condescending tone but suppressed it. I understand, I'll do my best. Richard studied her for a moment, as if assessing her sincerity. Good. It will also be necessary for you to refine some skills. Etiquette lessons, dance classes, perhaps even a new language. Everything will be arranged, of course. Caroline set down her utensils, looking directly at Richard. Mr. Thompson, Richard, I understand this is a business arrangement for you, but I'm not one of your employees. I'm your, well, legally, I'm your wife. I'd appreciate it if you treated me with a bit more humanity. For a moment, Richard seemed genuinely surprised. His eyes widened slightly, and Caroline thought she saw a faint blush on his cheeks. I apologize, he said finally, his voice a little less cold. You're right, it's not my intention to treat you two inhumanely. A silence fell between them, less tense this time. Caroline returned to her soup, feeling a bit more confident. Perhaps, Richard said after a few minutes, you could tell me a little about yourself. After all, we'll be living together for a year. It would be helpful to know you better. Caroline looked up, surprised by the sudden interest. Well, what would you like to know? You studied biology, correct? What drew you to that field? A genuine smile lit up Caroline's face for the first time that evening. I've always been fascinated by nature, especially plants. Growing up helping my father in the garden, well, it sparked a passion. There's something magical about seeing a seed turn into a flower, don't you think? Richard watched her with a curious expression, as if seeing something new and intriguing. I confess I've never given it much thought. My world has always revolved around numbers and strategies. Well, Caroline said, feeling more at ease, perhaps I can show you a bit of that world. The gardens here are beautiful, but I'm sure they could be even more impressive with some special touches. For the first time since they had met, Caroline saw a genuine, though small, smile on Richard's lips. That could be interesting. Maybe we could take a walk through the gardens tomorrow, and you could show me your ideas. The rest of the dinner flowed more naturally. Caroline talked about her studies, her experiences teaching, and even shared some funny stories from her childhood in the garden. To her surprise, Richard listened attentively, occasionally asking questions that showed genuine interest. When dessert was served, an elaborate chocolate creation that looked almost sinfully delicious, Caroline felt more relaxed than she had in days. You know, she said, savoring the last bite of her dessert, I think we can make this work. It won't be easy, but maybe we can at least be friends? Richard looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded slightly. Perhaps it would be pleasant. When dinner ended and they rose to leave, Caroline felt a subtle shift in the air between them. It wasn't friendship, not yet, but there was a budding mutual respect, a cautious curiosity. Good night, Caroline, Richard said, using her first name for the first time. Sleep well. Good night, Richard, she replied with a small smile. As she walked back to her quarters, Caroline reflected on the evening. It hadn't been what she expected, but somehow it felt like a promising start. In her room, she approached the small orchid on the nightstand. She gently touched one of its petals, remembering her mother's words about finding beauty even in the most unlikely places. Maybe, she whispered to the flower, there's more to this arrangement than I thought. Maybe there's hope for something more. With that thought, Caroline prepared for bed, feeling, for the first time since this whole madness began, truly hopeful about the future. On the other side of the mansion, Richard Thompson sat in his office, an untouched glass of whiskey in front of him. His thoughts kept returning to the dinner, to Caroline's smile, to the passion in her voice when she spoke about plants and nature. He caught himself smiling faintly, a gesture so rare it almost startled him. Quickly he composed his neutral expression, reminding himself that this was just business, nothing more. But as he prepared for a few more hours of work, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, something he wasn't ready to face, but that somehow didn't seem as frightening as it should. Fate, it seemed, had its own plans for the Thompson couple, and it was just beginning to reveal its hand. The following weeks were a whirlwind of adjustments for Caroline. Each day brought new challenges and discoveries as she tried to find her place in this new world of luxury and expectations. The etiquette lessons with Mrs. Elisa were a daily trial. The housekeeper, though not cruel, was strict and demanding. "No, Mrs. Thompson," Mrs. Elisa sighed for the 10th time that morning. "The salad fork goes on the outside, and please keep your elbows off the table." Caroline stifled a sigh of frustration. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Elisa. It's just that there are so many rules." The housekeeper softened her expression for a moment. "I know it's difficult, ma'am, but believe me, mastering these rules will help you feel more confident at social events, and confidence is everything in this world." Caroline nodded, determined to learn. It wasn't just because of her agreement with Richard, but for herself. She wanted to prove that she could adapt, that she deserved to be there. Dance lessons were another challenge. 3 times a week, an instructor came to the mansion to teach her the steps of the waltz, tango, and other rhythms she never imagined she would need to know. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, the instructor counted, guiding Caroline through the ballroom. "Remember, Mrs. Thompson, dancing is like a silent dialogue. You must feel the music, not just count the steps." Caroline tried her best, but often felt awkward and out of place. It was hard to imagine herself gliding gracefully across a ballroom, especially when she stumbled over her own feet every few steps. But not everything was difficult. To her surprise and delight, Richard had kept his promise to let her take care of the mansion's gardens. Every morning before her lessons and appointments, Caroline spent a few hours among the flowers and shrubs, feeling truly at peace for the first time since she had arrived there. It was during one of these mornings that Richard found her, kneeling, in the dirt, her hands soiled, and a radiant smile on her face as she planted some new rose bushes. "I see you're enjoying yourself," he remarked, his voice surprisingly gentle. Caroline looked up, slightly embarrassed to be caught in such a disheveled state. "Oh, Richard, yes, I am. I hope you don't mind that I started without consulting you. It's just that I saw these plants at the nursery and—" "Don't worry," he interrupted, a small smile on his lips. "The garden is your domain now. I trust your judgment." Caroline felt a warmth in her chest at those words. Trust. It was something she hadn't expected to receive so soon. "Thank you," she said sincerely. Would you like to see what I'm planning for this flower bed?" To her surprise, Richard nodded and knelt beside her, not seeming to mind that his expensive suit might get dirty. "So, what do we have here?" he asked, genuinely interested. Caroline began to excitedly explain the different varieties of roses she was planting, how they would bloom at different times to keep the garden colorful all year round. Richard listened attentively, occasionally asking questions that showed he was truly paying attention. "You know," he said after a while, "I never thought much about the gardens before. They were just part of the property. But seeing them through your eyes, I'm starting to understand the fascination." Caroline smiled, feeling an unexpected connection with the man beside her. "It's because plants have so much to teach us, Richard. About patience, resilience, about finding beauty, even in the most difficult circumstances." Richard looked at her in a way that made her heart skip a beat. There was something in his eyes, admiration, curiosity, that she had never seen before. "You are different from anyone I've ever met, Caroline," he said softly. The moment was interrupted by the sound of Richard's phone. He pulled it out of his pocket, his expression quickly shifting back to business mode. "I have to take this," he said, standing up. "But thank you for sharing that with me. It was nice." Caroline watched him walk away, feeling a confusing mix of emotions. There was something shifting between them, something subtle but undeniable. The days continued to pass, each bringing small changes and discoveries. Caroline began to feel more at ease in the mansion, learning the names and stories of the staff, finding favorite corners to read or simply think. One evening during dinner, which had now become a daily ritual for them, Richard surprised her with an announcement. "There's a charity event next week," he said, his tone casual, but his eyes attentive to her reaction. "It would be a good opportunity for your first public appearance as Mrs. Thompson." Caroline felt a chill in her stomach. "An event? Do you think I'm ready?" Richard studied her for a moment before answering. "I believe so. You've been doing well in your lessons and, well, I think your naturalness will be an asset." She blinked, surprised by the unexpected compliment. "My naturalness?" "Yes," Richard nodded. "You have a genuineness that's refreshing. I believe people will respond well to that." Caroline felt a blush rise up her neck. "Thank you," she murmured. "I'll do my best not to disappoint you." "I'm sure you won't," Richard said, and for the first time Caroline saw a genuine smile on his lips. That night, lying in her enormous bed, Caroline reflected on how her life had changed in such a short time. Just a few weeks ago, she was a simple teacher, the daughter of a gardener. Now she was Mrs. Thompson, about to make her debut in New York's high society. But more than that, she thought about Richard, about the cold, distant man she had met at the beginning, and the small changes she saw in him every day. The smiles that were becoming more frequent, the moments of vulnerability he occasionally let slip. "What's happening to us?" she whispered into the dark room. The answer, of course, did not come, but Caroline fell asleep with the feeling that whatever was happening between her and Richard, it was something neither of them had anticipated when they signed that contract. Fate, it seemed, had its own plans for the Thompson couple, and it was just beginning to reveal them. The night of the charity event arrived faster than Caroline expected. As she prepared in her room, assisted by a team of hairstylists and makeup artists, she felt the nervousness growing in her stomach. The dress that had been chosen for her was stunning, a long gown in a deep emerald green that accentuated her eyes and beautifully contrasted with her skin. It was more elegant and sophisticated than anything she had ever worn in her life. "You look beautiful, ma'am," said Sophia, the young maid who had become a constant and comforting presence for Caroline in recent weeks. Caroline smiled nervously at her reflection in the mirror. "Thank you, Sophia. I just hope I don't make a fool of myself out there." "Impossible," Sophia replied with conviction. "You have a natural grace that no etiquette class could ever teach." Those words warmed Caroline's heart, giving her a little more confidence. She took a deep breath, adjusted the necklace her mother had given her, the only piece from her old life she allowed to complement tonight's look, and left the room. Richard was waiting for her at the bottom of the stairs, impeccable in his tuxedo. When their eyes met, Caroline saw something that surprised her, a look of genuine admiration on Richard's usually impassive face. "You look stunning," he said, his voice slightly huskier than usual. Caroline felt her face flush. "Thank you. You look very handsome too." Richard offered his arm, which she accepted with a slight tremble in her hands. "Ready?" he asked softly. "As ready as I'll ever be," she replied with a nervous smile. The ride to the event was quiet, but not uncomfortable. Caroline noticed that Richard seemed almost as tense as she was, his fingers lightly tapping on his knee. "Is everything all right?" she asked gently. Richard seemed surprised by the question. "Yes, I'm just not a fan of these events. Too much politics, too many hidden agendas." Caroline nodded understandingly. "Well, at least we're in this together, right?" For a moment, Richard's face softened, and he gave a small smile. "Right." When they arrived at the venue, a lavish ballroom in one of New York's most luxurious hotels, Caroline felt her heart race. Dozens of photographers waited at the entrance, their flashes incessantly blinking. "Remember," Richard whispered, as he helped Caroline out of the car. "Smile, wave, but don't say anything. I'll handle the questions." Caroline nodded, clinging to Richard's arm as if it were her anchor. The flashes were blinding, the voices of the reporters a blur of questions and exclamations. "Mr. Thompson, who is your companion? Is it true? You married in secret? Ma'am, how does it feel to be the new Mrs. Thompson?" Richard skillfully navigated the crowd, answering some questions with vague, polite responses and ignoring others completely. Caroline did her best to keep a smile on her face, though inside she was trembling. Finally, they made it inside the ballroom. The view took Caroline's breath away. Hundreds of people in formal attire, a sea of sparkling jewels and dazzling gowns. "Breathe," Richard murmured, placing a gentle hand on her back. "You're doing wonderfully." His words calmed her slightly, and Caroline allowed herself to relax a little. They began to move through the hall, Richard introducing her to an endless stream of people whose names she could barely remember. To her surprise, Caroline found herself doing better than she had expected. The etiquette lessons with Mrs. Elisa had proven their worth, and she managed to navigate the social conversations with a grace she didn't know she possessed. "Caroline, darling," a familiar voice called out. It was Richard's aunt, the same woman who had spoken to her at the wedding. "How lovely to see you again. You look charming." The woman's tone was sweet, but Caroline could sense the venom behind the words. "Thank you, Mrs. Oh, please call me Beatrice," the woman replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "After all, we're family now, aren't we?" Caroline felt Richard tense beside her. "Aunt Beatrice," he said, his voice cool. "It's good to see you. I hope you're enjoying the party." "Oh, certainly," Beatrice replied, her eyes never leaving Caroline. "I was just telling the girls how refreshing it is to see new blood in the family, so quaint." Caroline felt the veiled insult but kept her smile in place. "Well, I'm happy to bring some freshness. I think every family needs new perspectives from time to time, don't you agree?" Beatrice seemed momentarily speechless, clearly not expecting such a direct response. Richard, on the other hand, looked like he was holding back a smile. "If you'll excuse us," he said, guiding Caroline away. "We have other guests to greet." Once they were out of Beatrice's earshot, Richard turned to Caroline, an expression of admiration on his face. "That was impressive. I've never seen anyone leave my aunt speechless before." Caroline felt a flush rise up her neck. "I shouldn't have said that. It was rude of me." "No," Richard said, surprising her with the firmness in his voice. "It was perfect. You put her in her place without losing your composure. I'm proud of you." Caroline's heart leapt at his words. It was the first time Richard had expressed pride in her, and the feeling was unexpectedly powerful. The evening continued, and Caroline found herself growing more and more at ease. She chatted with business people about sustainability projects, discussed art with collectors, and even managed to convince a few donors to increase their contributions to the night's charity cause. During a brief pause, while Richard was occupied with some associates, Caroline found herself alone at one of the hall's balconies, enjoying the cool night air. She looked out at the illuminated city below, reflecting on how much her life had changed. "Penny, for your thoughts." Richard's voice surprised her. She turned around, finding him standing at the counter door, 2 champagne glasses in his hands. He offered one to her, which she accepted with a grateful smile. "Just reflecting," she answered honestly, "on how everything changed so quickly. A few weeks ago, I was giving private lessons and helping my father in the garden. And now you're here," Richard completed softly, "winning everyone over with your natural charm." Caroline chuckled quietly. "I don't know if I'm winning anyone over, but thank you for giving me this chance, for trusting me." Richard studied her for a long moment, his expression softening in a way Caroline rarely saw. "You surprised me tonight, Caroline, in many ways." There was something in his voice, in his gaze, that made Caroline's heart race. For a moment, it seemed as if the world around them disappeared, leaving only the two of them there, under the stars. The moment was broken by the sound of someone calling Richard from inside the hall. He blinked as if snapping out of a trance and cleared his throat. I should go back," he said, his voice slightly hoarse. "Are you coming?" Caroline nodded, finishing her champagne. "Of course. After all, we're a team, aren't we?" Richard smiled, a genuine smile that lit up his face in a way Caroline had never seen before. "Yes, we are." As they walked back to the hall side by side, Caroline felt a wave of conflicting emotions. Something was shifting between them, something that went beyond the agreement they had made. It was thrilling and terrifying at the same time. The night continued, filled with dancing, conversations, and laughter. And though Caroline was surrounded by hundreds of people, she could only truly focus on one, the man by her side. whose eyes seemed to meet hers more and more often, whose touch on her back seemed to linger a little longer than necessary. When they finally left the party late at night, there was a different energy between them. An expectation, a tension that hadn't been there before. In the car on the way back to the mansion, Caroline looked at Richard and noticed he was watching her too. For a moment it seemed like he was about to say something, but then he simply smiled softly and turned his gaze to the window. Caroline did the same, her heart racing. She didn't know what the future held, but she had a feeling that after tonight nothing would be the same. Fate had rolled the dice and the game was just beginning. The days following the charity ball brought a subtle but noticeable change in the dynamic between Caroline and Richard. The success of the night seemed to have broken an invisible barrier between them, paving the way for a closeness neither of them had anticipated. Meals, once moments of polite but distant conversation, now stretched for hours, filled with lively discussions on a variety of topics. Caroline found in Richard an attentive listener and a passionate debater, especially when the subject was business or politics. One afternoon, as they walked through the gardens Caroline had been tending to with such care, Richard surprised her with an unexpected question. "Caroline," he began, his tone carefully neutral, "have you ever thought about going back to work?" She stopped pruning a rosebush, turning to face him in surprise. "Work? Well, I assumed my role now was to be the Mrs. Thompson's full-time." Richard shook his head, a small smile on his lips. "That's part of the agreement, yes, but it doesn't mean you have to give up your own interests and ambitions." Caroline felt a wave of emotion wash over her. It was the first time Richard had shown interest in her personal goals, beyond the role she played in his life. "Actually," she admitted, "I've been missing teaching, and there's a research project I've always wanted to develop about the use of native plants in sustainable urban landscaping." Richard's eyes sparkled with something that seemed like pride. "That sounds fascinating and extremely relevant considering current environmental concerns." Caroline nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly, but it would be hard to balance a project like that with my current obligations." Richard was silent for a moment, seeming to ponder something. Finally, he spoke. "What if I said we could make it work?" "How so?" "Thompson Enterprises has a sustainability division that could benefit from a project like yours," he explained. "We could arrange for you to lead research there, with all the flexibility needed to maintain your social obligations." Caroline felt her heart race at the possibility. You would do that for me?" Richard looked her in the eyes, his expression surprisingly soft. "Caroline, our agreement doesn't mean you have to stop being who you are. In fact, it's your passion, your intelligence that makes our partnership compelling." There was something in the way he said partnership that made Caroline feel a warmth spread through her chest. She smiled, genuinely moved. "Thank you, Richard. That means a lot to me." He nodded, seeming a bit uncomfortable with the intensity of the moment. "Well, let's work out the details then. I want to see this project come to life." In the days that followed, Caroline found herself immersed in a whirlwind of activity. Between meetings with the sustainability team at Thompson Enterprises, research in specialized libraries, and visits to native plant nurseries, she barely had time to breathe. But she was happy, more fulfilled than she had felt in a long time. Richard, on the other hand, seemed fascinated by her enthusiasm. Often he would find her late at night in the mansion's library, surrounded by books and notes. "I didn't know I married a workaholic," he joked one night, entering the library with 2 cups of tea. Caroline laughed, accepting the cup gratefully. "Look who's talking. The man who practically lives in the office." Richard sat down beside her, his eyes scanning the notes scattered on the table. It's different to see someone so passionate about something beyond profits and stocks. There was a note of sadness, envy, in his voice that made Caroline look at him more closely. "Don't you have something like that? Something that moves you, that makes you want to work late into the night just for the joy of doing it?" Richard fell silent for a long moment, his gaze lost in the darkness beyond the window. "There was a time," he finally said, his voice low, When I dreamed of being an architect, building beautiful, functional things that would improve people's lives. Caroline felt her heart tighten at the unexpected vulnerability in his voice. What happened? Life, he shrugged, a sad smile on his lips. Expectations. The family empire to manage. Young dreams give way to adult responsibilities. Without thinking, Caroline placed her hand on his. It's never too late to rekindle a passion, Richard. He looked at their joined hands, a complex expression on his face. For a moment it seemed like he might say something more, but then he just smiled softly. Maybe you're right, but for now, tell me more about your project. How can I help? And so, night after night, they met in the library. Caroline sharing her enthusiasm and knowledge, Richard offering insights from the business world and connections that could make the project an even greater reality. It was during one of these nights that something subtly shifted between them. Caroline was excitedly explaining about a native climbing plant that could be perfect for covering building facades, helping with thermal regulation. And the best part is that it attracts hummingbirds. Imagine, Richard, buildings in the heart of New York full of greenery and birds. When she turned to him, the excitement shining in her eyes, she found Richard looking at her with an expression she had never seen before. There was admiration there, yes, but also something more. Something warm, intense. You're amazing. You know that, he said softly, his voice husky. Caroline felt the air grow thick between them. Her heart raced and she found herself leaning almost imperceptibly toward him. Richard did the same, his eyes alternating between hers and her lips. For a moment, it seemed like time had stopped. They were so close that Caroline could feel Richard's breath on her face. Her heart was beating so loudly that she was sure he could hear it. And then, the moment was shattered by the shrill sound of Richard's phone. They pulled away abruptly as if shocked. Richard answered the phone, his voice quickly returning to its usual professional tone. Caroline, feeling her face burn, turned, her attention back to her books, trying to calm her racing heart. When Richard hung up, there was a palpable tension in the air. He cleared his throat, avoiding direct eye contact with her. I need to go. Urgent matter at the office. Caroline nodded, still unable to look at him. Of course, I understand. He stood up, hesitating for a moment as if he wanted to say something more, but then he just murmured a good night and quickly left the library. Alone, Caroline let out a trembling sigh. What had just happened? Or rather, what had almost happened? She touched her lips unconsciously, remembering how close they had been to Richard's. A confusing mix of emotions flooded her. Excitement, fear, guilt, desire. This wasn't part of the plan. It wasn't part of the agreement. They were supposed to be just partners in a business arrangement, nothing more. But as Caroline tried to refocus on her work, she couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. The delicate balance they had built was shifting into something more complex, more dangerous. And the scariest part? A part of her longed for that change, no matter how much her rational mind tried to deny it. On the other side of the mansion in his office, Richard Thompson stared into the darkness through the window, an untouched glass of whiskey in his hand. His thoughts were a whirlwind, centered on the woman who had entered his life as a business arrangement and now threatened to become something far more complicated. The days following the almost kiss in the library were filled with a palpable tension between Caroline and Richard. Both seemed to dance around each other, avoiding being alone together for too long. Their interactions marked by nervous smiles and superficial conversations. Caroline threw herself even deeper into her project, using work as a welcome distraction from her confused thoughts. Richard, on the other hand, began working even later in the office, coming home only when he was sure Caroline would already be asleep. It was during this period of distance that fate decided to throw another complication into the path of the Thompson couple. One morning, as Caroline was having breakfast alone in the spacious kitchen of the mansion, Mrs. Elisa entered with a worried expression. "Ma'am," she said hesitantly, there's a man at the door asking for you. He says he's your father." Caroline's heart leapt. Her father, here. She hadn't seen him since the wedding. though they had spoken on the phone regularly. "My father," she repeated, standing up quickly. "Where is he? Why didn't you let him in?" Mrs. Elisa seemed uncomfortable. "Well, ma'am, Mr. Thompson left specific instructions about unannounced visitors." "Nonsense," Caroline interrupted, already heading for the door. "It's my father, Mrs. Elisa. He's always welcome here." When Caroline opened the front door, her heart tightened at the sight of Anthony standing there, looking out of place, and a little embarrassed in his gardener's uniform. "Dad!" she exclaimed, throwing herself into his arms. Anthony hugged her tightly, and Caroline caught the familiar scent of earth and love she always associated with him. "My flower," he murmured, his voice choked. "I've missed you." She pulled him inside, ignoring the curious glances from the security guards. "Come, let's go to the kitchen. You must be hungry after your trip." In the kitchen, as Anthony ate, a breakfast fit for a king, Caroline watched him closely. There was something in his eyes, a worry she couldn't quite decipher. "Dad," she began softly, "is everything okay? Why this surprise visit?" Anthony set down his fork, sighing deeply. "Carol, my dear, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to see with my own eyes if you're okay, if you're happy." Caroline felt a lump form in her throat. "Of course, I'm fine, Dad. Richard has been very kind." Anthony studied her for a long moment. "But are you happy, sweetheart? Truly?" The question caught Caroline off guard. She opened her mouth to automatically say yes, but something stopped her. Was she happy? Comfortable, yes. Busy with her project, certainly. But happy? Before she could formulate an answer, Richard's voice sounded behind her, startling her. "Mr. Smith," he said, his voice cold and controlled. "What a pleasant surprise." Caroline turned, seeing Richard standing in the kitchen doorway, impeccable in his suit, an unreadable expression on his face. "Richard," she exclaimed, standing up. "I didn't know you were home." "Evidently," he replied, his eyes shifting between Caroline and Anthony. "Mr. Smith, I hope you're comfortable. I apologize for the confusion at the entrance. We weren't expecting visitors." Anthony stood up, staring at Richard with a mix of defiance and paternal concern. "I shouldn't need an invitation to see my own daughter, Mr. Thompson." The tension in the kitchen was palpable. Caroline glanced nervously between her father and her husband, feeling caught between two worlds. "Of course not," Richard replied, smoothly, though his eyes remained cold. "You're always welcome here. Caroline, why don't you take your father to see the gardens? I'm sure he'd appreciate it." Caroline nodded quickly, grateful for the out. "Great idea, shall we, Dad?" As she guided Anthony through the sprawling gardens of the mansion, proudly showing him the changes she had made, Caroline felt her heart grow heavy. Her father's surprise visit, Richard's cold reaction. It all made her question the delicate balance she had built in her new life. "It's quite a place, isn't it?" Anthony remarked, looking around with a mix of admiration and sadness. "So different from our little corner." Caroline felt a pang of guilt. "Dad, Anthony raised his hand, gently interrupting her. "No, my flower. Don't apologize. I just want to make sure you're happy here. That this arrangement was worth it." Caroline swallowed hard, feeling tears well up in her eyes. "Dad, it's complicated. Richard has been good to me. He gave me an incredible opportunity with my research project, but sometimes I feel..." "Feel what, Carol?" She hesitated, the words stuck in her throat. How could she explain the whirlwind of emotions she was feeling? The comfort mixed with loneliness, the gratitude with frustration, and now these new, unsettling feelings for Richard. "Sometimes I miss home," she finally admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "You, our simple life. But at the same time, I can't deny that here I have opportunities I never dreamed of having." Anthony hugged her tightly, and Caroline let the tears fall freely. "Oh, my little flower," he murmured. "You were always too strong for our small garden. Maybe this is the place where you can truly bloom." They stayed like that for a long moment, father and daughter united in a hug that seemed to try to bridge not just the physical distance, but the emotional gap that had formed between them. When they finally pulled apart, Anthony held Caroline's face in his calloused hands. "Just promise me you won't forget who you are, my Carol. Don't let this world of luxury and appearances change your heart." Caroline nodded, feeling a renewed determination. "I promise, Dad, I promise." The rest of the day passed quickly. Caroline showed Anthony her research project, her eyes shining with excitement as she explained her plans to revolutionize urban landscaping in New York. Anthony listened with evident pride, occasionally offering advice based on his vast practical experience. When it was time for Anthony to leave, Caroline felt her heart tighten again. They stood at the entrance of the mansion, the taxi waiting to take her father back to the life she had left behind. "Remember, my flower," Anthony said, holding Caroline's hands, "you will always have a home with us, no matter what happens." Caroline nodded, silent tears streaming down her cheeks. "I know, Dad. I love you." "I love you too, my Carol." With one last hug, Anthony got into the taxi. Caroline stood still, watching the car drive away until it disappeared from view. When she finally turned to go inside, she found Richard standing at the door, watching her with an expression she couldn't decipher. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice surprisingly soft. Caroline wiped away the tears, trying to compose herself. "Yes, it's just hard to say goodbye." Richard took a step toward her, seeming to want to comfort her, but then hesitated. "Caroline, I apologize if I was rude earlier. I wasn't expecting—" "No," she interrupted, shaking her head. "You don't need to apologize. My father showed up unexpectedly. I understand that it might have been inconvenient." Richard studied her for a long moment, an internal struggle clearly visible in his eyes. Finally he spoke. "You miss him, your old life." It wasn't a question, but Caroline felt she needed to respond. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but also, I'm grateful for this new life, for the opportunities, the experiences, for—" She hesitated, her heart racing. "For meeting you." Richard's eyes widened slightly at that admission. For a moment, it seemed like he might say something, take a step forward, break the invisible barrier they had built between themselves. But then, as so, often before the moment passed, Richard cleared his throat, recomposing his neutral expression. "Well, I'm glad you're satisfied with our arrangement. If you need anything—" "Thank you, Richard," Caroline said softly, feeling a mix of disappointment and relief. They entered the mansion side by side, but separated by an abyss of unspoken words, of repressed emotions. Caroline knew something had changed that day, within herself, in her relationship with Richard, in her view of her place in this new world. The weeks following Anthony's visit brought a subtle but noticeable shift in the dynamic between Caroline and Richard. There was a new tension in the air, a mutual awareness that went beyond the business arrangement they had made. Both seemed to be walking on eggshells, careful not to cross invisible lines that had been drawn. Caroline threw herself even deeper into her research project, using work as an escape from her confused thoughts and emotions. Richard, on the other hand, seemed to be spending more time at home, often finding excuses to pass by the greenhouse, where Caroline worked, or the library where she conducted her research. It was during one of these casual visits that fate decided to intervene once again. Caroline was hunched over a table in the library, surrounded by books and papers, when Richard entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "I thought you could use some caffeine," he said, placing one of the cups beside her. Caroline looked up, surprised and touched by the gesture. "Thank you, Richard. That's very kind of you." He shrugged, a small smile on his lips. "Well, I can't let the brilliant mind behind our new sustainability project run out of fuel, can I?" She laughed, feeling her heart race at the compliment. "Speaking of which, I think I've finally had a breakthrough. Look at this." Caroline stood up excitedly, grabbing some papers to show Richard. In her haste, she didn't notice that her chair was in the way. When she turned, she stumbled. Richard reacted instinctively, grabbing her by the waist to prevent her fall. For a moment, they were frozen in that position, their faces inches apart, Richard's arms firmly around her. Time seemed to stand still. Caroline could feel the warmth of Richard's body, the scent of his expensive cologne, his breath on her face. Their eyes met, and for the first time, she saw desire clearly reflected in his. "Caroline," Richard whispered, his voice hoarse. It was enough to break the spell. Caroline stepped back abruptly, feeling her face burn. I'm so sorry," she stammered. "I can be so clumsy sometimes." Richard cleared his throat, running his hand through his hair in an unusually nervous gesture. "Don't worry, I'm glad I caught you before you fell." A tense silence fell between them. Caroline turned her attention to the papers in her hands, desperately trying to regain the thread of their earlier conversation. "So, as I was saying," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I think I've found a solution to the irrigation problem we've been facing." Richard nodded, clearly grateful for the change of subject. "That's great. Why don't you show me what you've come up with?" They spent the next hour discussing the project, but there was a new tension in the air, a heightened awareness of each other that hadn't been there before. Their eyes would meet and quickly dart away, their fingers occasionally brushing as they pointed to something on the papers, sending shivers through both of them. When Richard finally excused himself, citing an important meeting, Caroline let out a shaky sigh. What was happening to her? To them? She walked over to the window, looking out at the garden. Her father's words echoed in her mind. "Don't let this world of luxury and appearances change your heart." But it wasn't the luxury that was changing her heart. It was Richard. The cold, calculating man she had first met was slowly giving way to someone more complex, more human, and she was falling for him against all logic and reason. That evening during dinner, the tension between them was palpable. They talked about trivial matters, carefully avoiding any mention of the incident in the library or the growing feelings between them. It was when Richard's phone rang. He answered with a look of surprise, which quickly turned to concern. "See," he said, his voice tense, "I'll be there as soon as I can." When he hung up, his face was pale. "Richard?" Caroline asked, worried. "What's wrong?" He hesitated for a moment before answering. "It's my father. He's had a heart attack. He's in the hospital." Caroline felt a tightness in her chest. Despite her complicated relationship with her father-in-law, she could see the anguish in Richard's eyes. "Oh, Richard," she said softly. "I'm so sorry. You need to go. Do you want me to come with you?" He seemed surprised by the offer, but then nodded slowly. "Yes, I think I'd like that." The drive to the hospital was quiet, the earlier tension replaced by shared concern. Caroline occasionally placed her hand over Richard's, offering silent comfort. At the hospital, they were met with a chaotic scene. Richard's aunt, Beatrice, was in the lobby, her face a mask of feigned concern. "Oh, Richard, darling," she exclaimed, completely ignoring Caroline. "I'm so glad you're here. Your father has been asking for you." Richard nodded stiffly. "How is he?" "Stable, for now," Beatrice replied, "but the doctors are worried. He wants to speak with you, alone." Richard shot an apologetic glance at Caroline before following a nurse to his father's room. Caroline stayed behind, feeling out of place and a little lost. It was then that Beatrice turned to her, her eyes cold and calculating. Well, she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "If it isn't our dear gardener, enjoying the life of luxury, aren't we?" Caroline felt her blood boil, but maintained her composure. "Mrs. Beatrice, I don't think this is the time for—" "Oh, don't worry." "Dear," Beatrice interrupted her, "I'm sure you're very concerned about your father-in-law. After all, if something happens to him, what will become of you and your precious arrangement?" Caroline froze. "What are you talking about?" Beatrice smiled, a cruel and satisfied smile. "Oh, come now, let's not pretend. I know all about your little arrangement with Richard. The marriage of convenience, the one-year contract. I must say, it was a masterstroke. But don't think it will last."